There are secrets even the greatest vampire hunters could never imagine. But I've seen them. I've witnessed the price these warriors paid to keep the world safe. And now, I stand at a crossroads with a decision I can't undo. Continue the fight, or let everything crumble.
If you love thrilling stories full of mystery and action-packed moments, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new video. Join us on this journey into a world full of intrigue and surprises. Be a part of our community today.
It was in the dead of night when I found the first clue, the first whisper of a forgotten past. My name is Ethan, and for as long as I could remember, I had been a vampire hunter, trained in the ancient arts, sworn to rid the world of the undead. But that night, something was different. I stumbled upon a torn page, hidden in the crumbling archives of the Hunter's Sanctuary, a place that had once been my home. The page spoke of a legendary hunter, someone whose name had been erased from history, Alexander Dorn. Alexander Dorn was a name I had never heard of, but the more I read, the more I felt the pull of his story. His tale was one of betrayal, of sacrifice, of choices too dark for anyone to comprehend. He was once part of the council of the greatest vampire hunters, but something had gone terribly wrong. They had abandoned him. They had erased him from their records, leaving behind only a single cryptic line. The price of power is a soul. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Why was he erased? What had he done? And most importantly, why was this information hidden away in the deepest vaults of our sanctuary? If not to warn future generations like mine, the answer would come soon enough. But first, I had to learn the truth about Alexander Dorn, and why my fate seemed to be tied to his. As I dug deeper into Alexander's past, strange things began to happen. Whispers in the dark, figures watching me from the corners of the room. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was following me. I went to the oldest and most trusted of our order, Serafina, a former mentor, to seek answers. She had always been there for me, guiding me through the harshest trials. But when I showed her the page, her expression changed. Her face grew pale, and for the first time, I saw fear in her eyes. "You shouldn't be looking into this, Ethan," she said quietly. "The hunters made a decision long ago to bury the past. Some secrets are better left forgotten." "But why?" I demanded. "What happened to him? And why did they make him disappear?" Serafina hesitated, her hands trembling as she pushed the papers away from her. Because Alexander wasn't just a hunter. He was something more, and the cost of that power was too great. The words haunted me. Power, the very thing we hunted vampires for. Could there be a connection between Alexander's lost power and the rise of a new, even more dangerous breed of vampire? I had to find out, and soon. Days turned into weeks as I relentlessly searched for more clues, but nothing seemed to connect. It wasn't until I uncovered a hidden chamber deep beneath the sanctuary that I finally found what I was looking for. Inside the chamber was an artifact, an ancient amulet, pulsing with a strange energy. It was said to hold the key to the resurrection of the dead, the very same amulet that had been part of Alexander's final mission. As I held the amulet, a chilling realization washed over me. Alexander hadn't just been erased from history. He had been buried, locked away in the deepest corners of the vampire hunter legacy. But why? Was it because he had become what we had sworn to destroy? Had the very thing he fought against taken root inside him? I knew then that I had no choice. I had to find out the truth. The resurrection of Alexander Dorn wasn't just about resurrecting a hunter. It was about confronting the darkness he had become. A darkness that threatened to consume not just the hunters, but the entire world. As I prepared to awaken Alexander, I faced a terrible truth. In resurrecting him, I might be unleashing a force beyond our control. a force that might be more dangerous than the vampires we hunted. The amulet could bring him back, but at what cost? Could I trust a man whose past had been wiped clean? Was the risk worth the potential power of having the greatest hunter of all time on our side? I stood at the crossroads, just as the first words of this story had warned me, to continue the fight or to let everything crumble. The choice was mine and mine alone. I stood alone in the crypt, the amulet glowing softly in my palm. The air was thick with the weight of history, the echoes of countless hunters who had come before me, their spirits now lost to time. I could feel their eyes on me, their judgment lingering in the shadows. But this wasn't their fight anymore. This was mine. With a deep breath, I placed the amulet on the altar. The stone beneath it vibrated with energy, and the ground trembled. I whispered the ancient incantation, words that had been passed down for centuries, hidden from all but the most trusted hunters. The amulet reacted, its glow intensifying, and the darkness in the crypt seemed to swirl, responding to its power. A sudden, chilling gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing every candle in sight. I froze, heart pounding. The temperature dropped sharply, and I could hear the faint sound of breathing, a heavy, labored breath, as if the very air had been sucked from the room. Then, a voice. "Who dares disturb my rest?" I didn't need to look. I could feel him standing behind me, the very presence of Alexander Dorn seeping into my skin, like a shadow that consumed everything in its path. "Ethan," he said, his voice low and rough, as though it hadn't been used in centuries. "You seek answers, but what price are you willing to pay?" I turned slowly, meeting the eyes of the legendary hunter. His face was gaunt, his features sharp and etched with age, but his eyes were the same, cold, intense, haunted. "What happened to you, Alexander?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Why were you erased from history? What did you do?" A long pause. His eyes narrowed, and he stepped forward, his movements deliberate and slow, as though he were testing the ground beneath him. "It wasn't what I did, Ethan," he said, his voice growing colder. "It was what I became." Alexander's story unraveled like a tapestry, one thread at a time. He spoke of his rise within the vampire hunter ranks, of his unyielding desire to eliminate every last vampire from the world. But there was more to it, far more. He had discovered ancient texts, forbidden knowledge that could amplify the power of any hunter. But it came at a terrible cost. "I became something more than human," he confessed, his voice low as if admitting a sin. "I unlocked abilities that none of our order was ever meant to have. And with that power came the darkness." He paused, staring at his hands as if seeing them for the first time in centuries. "I was no longer just a hunter, Ethan. I became what I fought against. A vampire hunter who hungered for more power, more control. I was consumed by it." His words were heavy, filled with regret and something darker. He had crossed a line, one that the council could never accept. They had banished him, erased his name, and buried him in the depths of their sanctuary, hoping the world would forget him. "And now you want me to join you in this fight?" I asked, my voice thick with doubt. "To fight against the very thing you became?" Alexander's gaze was steady, unwavering. "I have paid the price, but you, Ethan, you still have a choice. You can walk away, forget everything, live your life as it was before. Or you can join me. Together, we can finish what I started." His offer hung in the air, a dangerous proposition, one that could change everything. The weight of his words pressed down on me, each syllable a temptation, pulling me further into a world of moral ambiguity. But I knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The fight I had always known was no longer black and white. There were no simple answers, and if I was to continue this path, I had to be ready to face whatever lay ahead. I spent the following days in silence, torn between what Alexander had told me and my own beliefs. The very foundation of everything I had ever known was shaking. Vampire hunters were meant to be paragons of justice, protectors of the innocent. But Alexander had shown me a darker truth, one where power and corruption went hand in hand. I couldn't deny the temptation, the lure of that power, to have the strength to defeat not just vampires, but anything that threatened the balance of the world. The possibility was intoxicating, but at what cost? That night, I sought out Serafina again, hoping she could provide some clarity. But when I arrived at her quarters, I found her in a state of distress, her face pale and her hands trembling. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice shaking, "there's something you need to know, something you haven't seen. The true nature of the enemy you're facing." She led me to a hidden room beneath the sanctuary, a place where the oldest and most dangerous records were kept. The walls were lined with tomes and scrolls, some so old they were crumbling to dust. She opened one of the books, revealing a series of maps and diagrams, images of ancient, twisted vampires, beings unlike anything I had ever seen. "These creatures," she said, her eyes filled with fear, "are not just vampires. They are something older, something far more powerful. And they are waking up." The words hit me like a freight train. A new breed of vampire, more dangerous than anything we had ever faced. And it was only a matter of time before they would come for us all. The realization hit me hard. The true enemy was no longer just the vampires we had hunted for centuries. This new breed was a force unlike anything we had ever imagined. They were more than just predators. They were orchestrating something far more sinister, something that threatened not only humanity but the entire world. Alexander's resurrection was no accident. He had been brought back for a reason, to face this new threat. And I had to decide if I was ready to join him, to take on a battle that could very well destroy us all. But there was one thing I knew for certain. The days of being a lone hunter were over. To defeat this new enemy, I would need allies, vampires and hunters alike, bound together by a shared goal. And even as I prepared to face the darkness ahead, I knew one thing above all else. The fight had only just begun. I woke up the next morning with a gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach. The decision I had made to bring Alexander Dorn back was now a reality I couldn't escape. I had unleashed something ancient, something dangerous, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that without him, we stood no chance against the new breed of vampires that threatened to wipe us out. But I couldn't ignore the reality. I had allied myself with a man who had once crossed every line, and now his hunger for power was like a shadow, lurking just beneath the surface. As I prepared to meet him again, I knew the stakes were higher than ever before. I needed to make my move carefully, calculating every word, every action. Time was running out, and I needed to know where Alexander's true allegiance lay. I made my way to the underground sanctum where Alexander had taken refuge, a place beneath the ruins of an ancient church that had been abandoned long ago. The stone walls were cold, the air damp and heavy with the scent of decay. As I approached, I could feel the weight of his presence, the same intensity that had both drawn me in and filled me with doubt. He stood in the center of the room, his figure illuminated by a single beam of moonlight pouring through a crack in the ceiling. His eyes, dark and unreadable, met mine as I stepped forward. "You came," he said, his voice low, as though he'd been expecting me all along. "I'm not here to waste time, Alexander," I replied, my voice firm. "I need to know where you stand. The new breed of vampires. They're not like anything we've fought before. And I need to know, are you truly with me? Or do you have other plans?" A slow, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "Always so direct, Ethan. It's what I admire about you." His words, though seemingly complimentary, did nothing to reassure me. There was something unsettling about the way he spoke. Too smooth, too calculated. "Make no mistake," he continued, his gaze intense. "I am not your enemy, but understand this. I am not bound by the same rules you follow. If we are to defeat these creatures, it will require more than the old ways. It will require something far darker. I stiffened. And you think I'm ready to embrace that darkness? Alexander's gaze never wavered. You are already walking that line, Ethan. The question is, are you strong enough to walk it to the end? His words hung in the air, a challenge, a dare, and I couldn't ignore it. He was right. I was already bound to a path that led into the unknown, a place where the line between hunter and prey blurred. But did I have the strength to face what lay ahead? Was I willing to become the very thing I had spent my life hunting? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Alexander had made his case, but there was still a nagging uncertainty in my mind. I needed more than just his word. If we were to survive what was coming, we couldn't rely on one man's strength alone, no matter how powerful he had been. That's when I remembered Seraphina's words. She had warned me about a new breed of vampire, but there was one more thing she had mentioned, the Vampire Queen. She was the key to everything. If there was anyone who knew the true nature of this new threat, it was her. I had always been taught to despise vampires, to see them as nothing more than monsters. But now, I was faced with an uncomfortable truth. If I wanted to defeat this new enemy, I would have to make an alliance with one. The thought was repulsive, but there was no other option. If the hunters and vampires were to survive, we had to join forces. It wasn't just about hunting anymore, it was about survival. I made my way to a place known only to a few. A hidden vampire enclave. A sanctuary where the older vampires, those who still remembered the days before the bloodlust consumed them entirely, gathered. I had heard whispers of a place called the Crimson Court, a secret haven for those who had rejected the chaos of their kind. It was there that I hoped to find Lydia, the Vampire Queen. The Crimson Court was hidden deep in the heart of the city, a place where the ancient and the modern collided. The streets around it were quiet, almost deserted, as though the world outside had no idea what was happening beneath its surface. The architecture was Gothic, beautiful in its decay, and the air was thick with an uneasy tension. When I entered the court, I was met by Lydia's trusted lieutenant, a vampire named Raphael. He was tall, his features sharp and unyielding, a coldness in his eyes that mirrored Alexander's. There was no welcoming smile, no hand offered in friendship, just an unspoken understanding between us. This meeting was a necessity, not a choice. "You seek Lydia," Raphael said, his voice a low growl. "But know this, Hunter. The Queen does not ally with those she does not trust." "I'm not here for favors," I replied. "I'm here because we have a common enemy, and we need to work together to survive." Raphael's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing, simply leading me deeper into the court. The corridors were lined with dark portraits, and the soft sound of murmuring voices echoed from behind closed doors. As we reached the throne room, the air seemed to grow colder still. There, sitting atop a throne made of twisted black iron, was Lydia, the Vampire Queen. Her beauty was striking, but there was an undeniable chill to her presence, an aura of power that made the room seem smaller in her presence. Her pale skin contrasted sharply with the dark, flowing gown she wore, and her eyes, the color of midnight, seemed to pierce through me. "You are brave to come here," she said, her voice both melodic and dangerous. "And foolish to think I would help you." "I don't need your help," I said, trying to mask my unease. "But we need to work together. The vampires we're facing now are not like any we've encountered before. If you want your kind to survive, you'll need to fight alongside us." She regarded me for a long moment, then stood up from her throne. "Then let's see if you are worth the risk, Hunter." Now, with Alexander and Lydia at my side, two unlikely allies, our next step was clear. We had to strike first. The new breed of vampires would not wait for us to make the first move. The clock was ticking, and every second brought us closer to the war we weren't prepared for. But one thing was certain: the battle ahead would test us all. It would force us to confront not only the darkness within our enemies, but the darkness within ourselves. And as I stood with Alexander and Lydia, I realized something that chilled me to my core. This fight might not only decide the fate of vampire hunters, but of humanity itself. The days leading up to the confrontation were filled with tension. Every moment seemed to stretch into infinity as we prepared for war. I had never imagined I'd be working alongside a vampire queen and a resurrected hunter, but here I was, walking the fine line between humanity and darkness. Alexander's presence in our camp was unsettling. While I had come to accept that his power was needed, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something, perhaps something darker than he let on. Lydia, too, was an enigma. Her coldness toward me was palpable, but I couldn't deny her intelligence. She knew the vampires we were facing. She had seen their kind before. "What are they planning, Lydia?" I asked one evening as we sat together in the dimly lit war room. "These creatures, they're not like any vampires we've fought. They're organized, strategic. This isn't just about feeding. They want something bigger." Lydia's eyes glinted with a quiet understanding, and she leaned forward, her voice low. "They are not just vampires, Ethan. They are descendants of an ancient bloodline. Their leader, Solomon, is not just a vampire. He is a creature of legend, older than anything we've encountered. And he has a goal: to overthrow both vampire and hunter alike." Her words chilled me. I had heard rumors of Solomon, but no one believed them. The leader of the new breed was a name whispered in fear, a shadow that hung over every vampire hunter's nightmares. "How do we stop him?" I asked, feeling the weight of the question settle in the pit of my stomach. Lydia stood, her long cloak flowing around her like an extension of her own darkness. "We don't just stop him. We destroy everything he's built. We take out his heart, the core of his army." I nodded. It was clear now that this wouldn't be an easy battle. Solomon had built an army not just of vampires, but of loyal followers. The very thought of facing an army of creatures that had the ability to blend into the shadows, to strike without warning, was enough to make my heart race with fear. But I had no choice. Couldn't back down. Not now. Not when the fate of humanity hung in the balance. The night of the strike arrived faster than I expected. We had learned where Solomon's stronghold was located. An ancient castle, hidden deep in the forest, shrouded by magic and guarded by his army. It was a fortress that seemed impenetrable, but we had one advantage: surprise. We gathered our forces, vampires, hunters, and those who had agreed to join our cause. They all understood the gravity of what was at stake, but I could sense the hesitation in their eyes. We were fighting not just for survival, but for everything we had known. And yet, as the moon hung low in the sky, we made our move. I stood at the front with Alexander and Lydia by my side. The army of vampires moved like shadows, disappearing into the night as we approached the gates of Solomon's stronghold. There was no turning back. The first wave of attack was swift. We fought through the vampire minions who guarded the outer walls, their eyes glowing with a menacing hunger. But even as we dispatched them, I knew this was only the beginning. The real battle would come when we reached Solomon. As we infiltrated the castle, the atmosphere grew heavier, colder. The air was thick with the scent of blood, old and new, a reminder of how long this place had been a stronghold of darkness. Every corner seemed to hold a secret. Every hallway echoed with the whispers of ancient magic. Finally, we reached the central chamber, where Solomon awaited us. The doors swung open, revealing the dark figure of the vampire lord. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and his presence filled the room with an oppressive force. "You are fools," Solomon said, his voice deep and resonant. "You think you can stop me? You think you can defeat what has been building for centuries?" Lydia stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. "It's over, Solomon. Your time has passed." For a moment there was silence. Then, with a flick of his hand, Solomon summoned his followers. Vampires and creatures I had never seen before, twisted by dark magic. They surged forward, attacking us with a ferocity that took us all by surprise. The battle raged on. Every swing of my blade, every shot of my crossbow, every blow I struck against the vampire hordes felt like a fight against time itself. Solomon's minions were relentless, and though Alexander and Lydia fought fiercely by my side, I could see their weariness in their eyes. This was no ordinary battle. It was a battle of survival, of forces that shouldn't exist, against a future we weren't prepared for. But there was more at play here. As the battle intensified, I began to notice something strange. Solomon wasn't fighting directly. He was watching, observing, waiting. Then I realized the truth. Solomon's goal wasn't just to defeat us. It was to corrupt us. As he stood there, hidden in the shadows, I could feel his power seeping into the room. An energy that wasn't just dark but twisted. It was like an invisible force, a pull toward destruction. And that's when I felt it. Something inside me shifting. The temptation Alexander had warned me about, the darkness I had been walking closer to, was now within reach. It whispered in my mind, urging me to give in, to take Solomon's power for myself. I stumbled, my sword slipping from my grip as I fought the surge of darkness within me. But then, a hand reached out to steady me, Lydia's. "Don't listen to it," she whispered, her voice calm but filled with urgency. "He's trying to break you." The words snapped me out of my haze. I clenched my fists, taking a deep breath. This was the moment where I could give in or I could fight back. With Lydia's help, I pushed through the darkness. Together, we charged at Solomon, our combined force taking him by surprise. Alexander joined us, his blade cutting through the air with a precision born of centuries of battle. And with one final, powerful blow, we struck Solomon down, his body crumbling into dust as the last remnants of his dark magic dissipated into the air. The battle was over, but the cost was high. We had won, yes, but at what price? The castle lay in ruins, and many of our allies had fallen. The vampire hunters and vampires who had joined us were now scattered, their numbers decimated. I stood in the ruins of the castle, staring at the place where Solomon had fallen. The weight of what we had just done settled in my chest. The fight was won, but the war would never truly be over. The darkness that had almost consumed me was still there, lurking beneath the surface. But now I knew I had a choice, to fight it or to succumb to it. Lydia and Alexander stood beside me, their expressions unreadable, their eyes haunted by the same truth. We had won, but the world had changed. And so had we. Where do we go from here? I asked, my voice thick with uncertainty. Lydia's eyes met mine, her gaze steady. "We rebuild," she said simply, "but we do it differently. We have learned the cost of power, and we will never forget it." And so, the untold stories of vampire hunters continued, not with the end of one war, but the beginning of another. The future was uncertain, but we had faced the darkness and lived to tell the tale. And for now, that was enough. The end? Or is it? In the aftermath of the battle, the world felt both eerily silent and suffocatingly loud. The winds had carried the ashes of Solomon, but they also carried the remnants of our choices. The reality was stark. We had won the fight, but we had lost so much more. The alliances we had forged in the heat of battle were now fragile and uncertain. I could feel the weight of leadership pressing on my shoulders, an unknown responsibility that I hadn't prepared for. Lydia, once a distant, calculating force, had become more human. She had shown vulnerability in the moments after the battle. I could see the cracks in her facade. The vampire queen, who had ruled over darkness for centuries, was now facing a new world, one where her own kind no longer feared her, and the threat of the new breed had been wiped away. But there was more to this new world than just surviving. As we sat around the fire, the flickering flames casting long shadows on our tired faces, I realized we couldn't go back to the way things were. Even the vampire hunters, though victorious, had been forever changed. "I've been thinking," Alexander spoke, breaking the silence. "We've won, yes, but the cost of what we've done. It's not over. There will always be more battles. More shadows lurking in the corners." He was right, of course. Victory had only given us temporary respite. The future of both vampire and hunter was uncertain, and in the wake of Solomon's fall, new powers would rise. It was only a matter of time before we were forced to confront them. We had established a fragile peace. The vampire hunters, along with the vampires who had sided with us, now coexisted in a tentative alliance. But with Solomon's fall, a new power vacuum had emerged. Lydia's leadership, while strong, was still in its infancy, and not all vampires were ready to follow her. Some viewed her as weak, others saw her as a mere shadow of the queen she once was. "We need a new order," I said to her one night, as we looked out over the remains of the battlefield. The fires had long since burned out, leaving only scorched earth behind us. "The old ways won't work. If we are to survive in a world where vampires and hunters must coexist, we must create something different." Lydia's gaze softened as she looked at me. "You want to lead." I met her eyes, the fire in my chest igniting once again. "Not just me, all of us. We need to find a balance, Lydia. No more divisions between vampire and hunter. We fight as one now, or we risk everything we fought for." She studied me for a long moment, weighing my words carefully. Then, with a resigned sigh, she nodded. "Then we'll do it together. But the road ahead will not be easy. There will be resistance." "I'm ready for it," I said, the determination in my voice unwavering. We began the process of rebuilding, but it wasn't easy. The war had left scars that no amount of time could heal. Each faction, vampire and hunter alike, held onto their grudges, their beliefs, and their loyalty to their old ways. The vampires were divided. Many still feared the power they had lost under Solomon's reign, and others remained loyal to their own ancient ways, rejecting the idea of unity with the hunters. There were whispers of rebellion, of factions planning to take back control, to rebuild the old vampire monarchy. Meanwhile, the hunters, though weary, were beginning to see the potential of unity, but their reluctance to trust the vampires was palpable. Old prejudices ran deep, and the idea of working together was a bitter pill to swallow. We traveled far and wide, speaking to leaders on both sides, offering promises of peace, but the reality of what we were asking was more than many could bear. Each conversation was a battle in itself, filled with tension, mistrust, and conflicting ideals. In one such meeting, we met with Leaf, a leader of a powerful faction of vampire hunters who had refused to join our cause during the war. His camp had remained neutral, refusing to side with either the vampires or us. He was a hardened man, distrustful of all vampires, and as we sat across from him, the weight of his words was clear. "Do you really think that this is the end?" Leaf asked, his voice rough, filled with disbelief. "You think Solomon was the last of them? There will always be more. And every time you try to trust these creatures," he said, pointing toward Lydia, "you risk everything. You can never trust them." Lydia's eyes flashed with anger, but she said nothing. She knew that speaking in defense of her kind would only fuel the fire. I looked at Leaf, my voice steady. "I don't expect you to trust them, not yet. But you must understand we're all that's left. The old ways are gone, and the only way forward is together. If we don't unite, if we continue to fight among ourselves, we'll fall. All of us." Leaf considered this for a moment, his eyes searching mine. Finally, he sighed, his shoulders slumping in resignation. "I don't trust you, Ethan. Or her." He nodded to Lydia. "But for the sake of what's left, I'll follow. For now." It wasn't a victory, but it was a start. The journey ahead was long. The world we were rebuilding was fragile, and we faced challenges on every side. Internal conflict, resistance from both vampires and hunters, and the constant threat of new dangers emerging in the darkness. But we had one thing that kept us going, the belief that, together, we could build something better. The vampire hunters, once a divided and secretive order, began to grow stronger, learning to work with the vampires who had allied with us. Lydia, though still a queen in her own right, became something more. She was a leader, someone who could bridge the gap between two worlds that had been enemies for centuries. And I was no longer just a hunter. I was a leader, a bridge between the two sides. I had faced the darkness within myself and had emerged stronger. I wasn't just fighting to protect humanity anymore. I was fighting for a future where both vampires and hunters could survive. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with danger and challenges we couldn't foresee. But one thing was clear: we were no longer defined by our past. We were writing our own future, and together we would face whatever came next. The end, for now. Months passed since the battle, and the fragile alliance between vampires and hunters had begun to show signs of wear. Though we had made progress, the road to peace was never a straight path. New tensions arose, some small and barely noticeable, others larger and harder to ignore. Leaf and his faction remained uneasy allies, still skeptical of our cooperation with the vampires. The hunters who had once fought side by side with me now questioned every decision I made, and whispers of rebellion started to stir again within their ranks. They had agreed to the truce, yes, but the idea of a lasting peace felt impossible for many of them. They had been raised to view vampires as monsters, and it wasn't easy to erase centuries of hatred and fear. On the other side, the vampires, despite Lydia's leadership, were still divided. Some were loyal to her, understanding that this new order was their only chance for survival. But others had lost too much during Solomon's reign and refused to follow her vision. These dissenters spoke in hushed tones of regaining their power and overthrowing Lydia. I could see it in their eyes, an insatiable hunger for dominance that had not yet been quelled. And all of this turmoil was simmering beneath the surface, threatening to explode at any moment. I had to act fast before everything we had worked for crumbled to dust. The world needed a solution, and it needed it quickly. The question was, how much more of our past could we leave behind? And how much of the future would we have to sacrifice to make this fragile alliance work? Part 22. The Return of the Shadows. As the unrest grew, a shadow from our past returned. We had thought Solomon's death would bring about the end of the old vampire regimes, but we were wrong. A new player had entered the game. Aurelia, a rogue vampire who had been part of Solomon's inner circle. She had vanished during the final battle, escaping before we could catch her. But now she was back, and she was determined to seize control of the vampire world. Lydia had warned us of her, and yet, I didn't believe her at first. The vampire queen had been so focused on maintaining order that she failed to notice the cracks forming beneath her. Aurelia, like Solomon before her, wanted power, and she would do whatever it took to claim it. I received word of her arrival through one of our spies. She had gathered an army of loyal vampires and had begun to attack our outposts. But she wasn't just aiming at the vampires who still followed Lydia. She was targeting anyone who stood in her way. Hunters, vampires, anyone. It didn't matter. To her, this was about one thing: domination. I couldn't let this happen. Not again. Not after everything we had fought for. Ethan, Lydia said, standing beside me as we looked over the map of our current position. We need to stop her. If Aurelia gets control, it will undo everything. I know, I replied, my fingers trembling as I traced the map. But we're not just fighting her now. We're fighting everything that's broken between us and our allies. If we make the wrong move, this war will turn into something worse than before. You know what has to be done, Lydia said, her voice hardening. She won't stop until she has all of us under her rule. You must strike before she grows too strong. Her words were clear, but I could sense the doubt in her eyes. She didn't want to fight her own kind. Not again. But there was no other choice. Aurelia had to be stopped, no matter the cost. The battle against Aurelia and her forces was brutal. We launched a series of raids against her strongholds, hitting them fast and hard. But the longer we fought, the clearer it became that her forces were more organized than we had initially thought. She had spies everywhere, even within our ranks. One night, as I made my way through the camp, I overheard a conversation between two of my closest allies, Jonas and Serafina. Their voices were low, but the words carried a weight I couldn't ignore. "You can't keep doing this, Serafina," Jonas said, his voice filled with frustration. "This alliance is going to get us all killed. The vampires will never be true allies. You know that, and neither will the hunters. They don't trust us." "You don't understand," Serafina responded, her voice trembling. "I'm trying to hold everything together. The world is changing. I have to believe we can find a way." "But you're blind," Jonas snapped. "Aurelia is our opportunity to rebuild everything we've lost. We can end this madness before it goes any further. The hunters are with me. The vampires who want peace, they're with me. We don't need Lydia. We don't need Ethan." I froze, my heart pounding. Betrayal. It was right in front of me. I didn't know how long they had been planning this, but the realization hit hard. Jonas, someone I had trusted for years, had been secretly working against me, against Lydia, against the future we had fought to create. Serafina, too, was involved, but I couldn't believe it. Not her. She had always been the voice of reason, the one person I could count on. But now everything had changed. The next few days were filled with tension. I confronted Serafina in private, hoping that I could get answers, hoping that I could understand why she had chosen this path. "I thought you believed in our cause," I said, my voice cold. "Why betray us now?" She looked away, unable to meet my gaze. "It's not a betrayal, Ethan. It's survival. We've all been playing a dangerous game, but Aurelia offers us a chance at real power. Lydia, she's weak. You're weak. The world needs strength. It needs a leader who can give it the direction it needs." I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "And you think that leader is Aurelia?" Serafina's silence was answer enough. I knew where her allegiance lay. "I won't let you destroy what we've worked for," I said firmly. "This ends now." The war against Aurelia was no longer just a battle for power. It was a fight for the soul of the new world we were trying to build. The stakes were higher than ever before, and the lines between right and wrong had never been more blurred. Serafina's betrayal cut deeper than anything I had experienced. But it also made one thing clear. The fight was never just about vampires or hunters. It was about the people we trusted, and whether we were strong enough to hold onto what mattered most. The final confrontation loomed ahead. Aurelia, with her army of loyal followers, was ready to strike at the heart of our alliance, and I had to make a choice. Fight for what I believed in or risk losing it all. The future was uncertain, but one thing was for sure. This war would be the one to define us all. The decision to face Aurelia wasn't just mine anymore. It was the only path we had left, despite the betrayal, despite the crumbling of alliances. The very foundation of our fragile peace was being shattered, and every action I took now carried the weight of an uncertain future. The camp was on high alert. The hunters and vampires who had sided with us, still reeling from the betrayals within, gathered under the dim moonlight. There was fear in their eyes, not just fear of Aurelia, but fear of what we were becoming. The trust that had once been the heart of our unity had been cracked wide open, and now we faced an uncertain battle, both against the forces of darkness and the forces within. "Are we ready?" I asked, my voice loud enough to break the silence that had settled over the camp. Lydia, who had been standing by my side through all of this, met my gaze. Her expression was unreadable, but I saw the flicker of determination in her eyes. She was ready. We have no choice but to be. The time had come to move. We knew where Aurelia would strike. Her forces were moving to take the last stronghold of the Alliance, a fortress hidden deep in the mountains. It had been our sanctuary, but now it was our last hope. If we lost it, there would be nothing left. The journey to the stronghold was perilous. We had no reinforcements left, just the core of our fighters, those who still believed in the possibility of peace, in the possibility of something greater than the endless cycle of death and war. And yet, as we marched together, I couldn't help but wonder, had we already lost? Was peace really possible, or was this just another illusion? A fleeting dream that had no place in a world built on power struggles and betrayal? As we neared the stronghold, I spotted Aurelia's army in the distance. She was waiting, not for an attack, but for us to come to her. She had learned that we would fight to the bitter end. She knew how to exploit our desperation. The camp erupted into chaos as Aurelia's forces appeared from the shadows. They weren't just vampires. They were something else entirely, twisted creatures, enhanced by Aurelia's dark magic. There was no honor in her army, only pure, chaotic hunger. "Prepare yourselves," I shouted. "We fight for everything." The battle was nothing like we had ever fought before. Aurelia's forces were relentless, moving like a flood of darkness, overwhelming us at every turn. But we fought back with everything we had left, striking fiercely and with purpose. The clash of weapons and the cries of battle filled the air, creating a symphony of chaos. Lydia and I fought side by side, each blow we struck seemingly adding weight to the burden we both carried. She fought with the fury of a queen desperate to prove herself, while I fought for the future we had dreamed of. And yet, even as we pushed forward, I could feel the shift. The darkness within me, the temptation I had fought so hard to suppress, was once again clawing at my thoughts. I could hear it, whispers promising power, telling me that I was meant for more, that I could end this war right now with a single stroke. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. Not like this. It was then that I saw Serafina, standing at the forefront of Aurelia's forces, her eyes cold and distant. She had become a symbol of everything I had feared. Someone who had once stood with us, now aligned with the very force that threatened to destroy everything. "You should have joined me, Ethan," she called out over the din of battle. "This could have been our world to rule. The peace you fought for, it's a lie. Only strength will last. Only power." I met her gaze, my heart heavy with regret. "You've lost yourself, Serafina. This isn't the way." She smiled darkly, raising her blade. "It's too late for that." With a swift motion, she attacked. But before I could react, Lydia stepped forward, her own blade clashing with Serafina's. The two women, once friends, now enemies, fought fiercely, their movements a blur as they clashed with all the fury of their fractured histories. But there was no time to dwell on the personal. Aurelia was at the center of the battlefield, drawing power from the very darkness she had cultivated. If we were to defeat her, we would have to face the core of that power. As I fought my way toward Aurelia, I saw the destruction around me. The world we had tried to rebuild was on the verge of crumbling, not from an external enemy, but from the choices we had made. I had always known that power was a double-edged sword, but now, standing in the heart of battle, I saw the full cost of it. Aurelia stood at the center, her eyes glowing with the energy she had stolen from the chaos. "You think you can stop me?" she asked, her voice dripping with venom. "I am beyond your reach. I will reshape this world. I will rule." "You won't," I said, my voice firm, despite the doubt that still lingered. "This world is not yours to shape." With a roar, she summoned all of her dark magic, and the air around us crackled with power. I felt it too, the pull, the temptation to give in, to absorb the power that she had harnessed. The weight of it was almost unbearable, but I knew I couldn't let it control me. The battle had already cost me so much, and the price for victory wasn't just defeating Aurelia. It was making the choice to walk away from the power that could have destroyed us all. With a single, final push, I summoned the strength to strike. My blade met hers, and with one swift motion, I ended the battle. The dark magic shattered, and Aurelia's form crumbled into dust. But as I stood there, panting, heart racing, I realized that even though we had won the battle, the war inside me wasn't over. The darkness I had fought so hard to resist was still there, and as long as it remained, we would never truly be free. The aftermath of the battle was quiet. The world around us was still, save for the occasional cry of a fallen warrior. The vampires who had stood with Aurelia were scattered, their numbers decimated, and those who remained had begun to understand the cost of their loyalty to her. Lydia stood by my side, her face solemn as she surveyed the battlefield. We had won, yes, but the world we had built was fragile. The peace we sought was tenuous at best, and the fractures between vampire and hunter were far from healed. Where do we go from here? I asked, my voice weary. Lydia's gaze was unwavering. We rebuild, but we rebuild differently. We cannot ignore the darkness within us. We must face it together. Together. The word had a weight I wasn't sure I was ready to carry, but it was the only way forward. The world would never be the same, and neither would we. But as long as we fought side by side, there was hope. Hope for a future where vampire and hunter could live together, not as enemies, but as allies. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time in a long while, I believed it was a road worth walking. And, for now, the open road ahead. The days following the battle were filled with quiet reflection. The world around us was healing, but the scars of war would never fade. The alliance between vampires and hunters was still fragile, held together by fragile threads of trust that could snap at any moment. But in the wake of Aurelia's fall, there was a glimmer of hope, a chance for something new. Lydia and I had spent countless hours speaking with leaders on both sides, attempting to rebuild what had been shattered. There were still pockets of resistance, both from vampires who could not accept her rule and hunters who believed the vampires were too dangerous to trust. But slowly, the wounds were beginning to heal, one decision, one small act of kindness at a time. Despite the progress, there was a nagging feeling in the back of my mind. The darkness that had tempted me during the battle, the very thing I had fought to resist, was still there, lingering beneath the surface. And it wasn't just me. We had all been touched by the choices we made, the blood we had spilled. The question wasn't whether we had defeated Aurelia. It was whether we could ever truly escape the shadows that had shaped us. And then, there was Serafina. I had thought we were finished with her, but her betrayal, her belief that strength and power were the only true forces in the world, had left a mark that couldn't be erased so easily. Word had reached us that she was still alive, somewhere in the wilderness, gathering followers who shared her vision of a new order. She hadn't given up. She hadn't been defeated. "Ethan," Lydia said one evening as we stood outside the council hall, looking out at the horizon, "do you ever wonder if we'll truly be at peace?" I turned to her, my gaze meeting hers. "I don't know if we ever can be. Not with the world we've built. Not with what's inside us." She nodded, understanding the weight of my words. There will always be those who wish to rule. Always someone who believes they can control what we fought to build. We stood there for a long time, the cool evening breeze ruffling our hair, before I finally spoke again. "Then we'll fight for it. We'll keep fighting. For the world we believe in. For the world we can build." Lydia looked at me, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "And what if we're not strong enough? Then we fight anyway," I said. "It's all we can do." As I turned away from the horizon, I knew that this war was far from over. But I also knew that we had taken the first steps toward something better, something worth fighting for. And just as I was about to leave the courtyard, a voice called out to me, "Ethan." I turned around and saw Jonas, his face shadowed by the weight of all we had been through. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that made my heart skip a beat. For a moment, it felt like we were back in the thick of the war, as if time had collapsed and we were once again on opposite sides. "What is it, Jonas?" I asked, my voice cautious. "I think we both know," he said, his voice low and heavy. "That this fight isn't over." I nodded. "I know, but we've won some battles. We've rebuilt. That's enough for now." Jonas looked at me with a strange intensity in his gaze. "It may be enough for now, but what about when the next battle comes? The world we're trying to create, can it ever truly be free of what we fought against? Or are we just delaying the inevitable?" His words lingered in the air, unanswered. There were no easy answers, no simple paths forward. We were standing at the crossroads of a new world, one we had yet to fully shape. And as the night fell and the stars began to twinkle in the sky, I realized that the journey was far from over. There were forces within and beyond us that would always seek to tear us apart. But there were also those who still believed in the possibility of a better world. We had made our choice. Now it was up to us to walk the road ahead together or apart. The end, or is it?